Hello and welcome to Meeting People with me, Amal Pandya. Meeting People is a podcast where I have long conversations with rebellious, adventurous and sometimes courteous free spirits. Good morning, Nigel. Thank you for sparing the time.
Thank you.
As you know, the theme of this podcast is conversations with rebellious, adventurous free spirits. And that I think describes perfectly the subject of your latest book, Pythagoras, which I'm going to hold a copy of up now, but also yourself. And before we get on to the book, I thought it'd be great for people to get a bit of context about who you are. And so, as a teaser, you've spent the last 15 years in Greece and the prior 35 years in Italy. Prior to that, you finished your education. So what have you been doing in that time?
An awful lot of studying in the school of life. I decided very early on that I didn't want to stay in the grey and wet north and to move into the Mediterranean. And that's not just a weather decision, a meteorological decision. It's because I felt right from the very first time I went there as a teenager that there's something very special about this inland sea, which was felt to me like a kind of piazza with all these interesting cultures dotted around: the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, all the cultures that have grown up since then about that. So the Mediterranean has always had a huge appeal for me, principally its art and architecture, and more recently its thinking. And yes, I spent 33 years of my life living in Italy, teaching at the university there, taking students. History of art, basically, and history of architecture. And I began by taking students to Greece because I thought that was there was something there I wanted to get a hold on, and I've ended up moving there because, as you'll have understood from reading the book, and anybody who does, my take on history and on thinking is that geography, namely physical geography, the landscape, the nature of the land where you live, the very physical parameters of your living natural environment determine the way you think. And this determines, broadly speaking, the way the Egyptians think, the way the Greeks think, the way the Romans thought, all these different cultures, the way the British think, and always have done. And so, that's been my mission.
And I first came across your work probably about 7 years ago when I was on an island called Chios, which is a Greek island very close to Turkey. And I had one of your travel books, guidebooks. You've written a series of about 20 volumes covering about 70 islands. Is that right? In Greece. And that focus on the geography and how that drives outcomes was very noticeable now that you mention it. But you basically have provided a really thorough way for someone going to this country, which is so deep and full of history, to actually get a taste of it in a way that, if you go and sit on a beach, you just can't do. So you have this ability to kind of get to grips with what ancient Greece was and how that results in where we are today. And I've used it for Paros, I've used it for Kythera, and I've gifted it, the whole collection, to 2 or 3 people. And I would love you to talk about what drove you to write those travel books, and why people should, have them when they go to an island, or even pick an island from them off their shelf and go there.
Okay, 2 things. I think I felt, as someone who was teaching students and taking students and teaching them about the classical world and about why it's important, there were sort of two obstacles to get over. One was the perception that the Greek world, and particularly the Greek island world, was one really of beaches and bars and didn't really have a great deal of historical interest. Well, that's a sort of very minor and more recent one. But the older one is that the way in which people have written about and talked about the ancient Greek culture in the past has always been inevitably very Athenocentric. In other words, the picture we have of ancient Greece comes from Athenian writers that have been studied and restudied and pored over for centuries. And the islands have been de-emphasized. Now, if the islands weren't important, that wasn't a big oversight, but they are very important. Before Athens becomes the great city it becomes in the 5th century BC, there were other cities like Samos, which is, of course, the home of Pythagoras, which had a bigger navy, which was richer, which was more important, which was more inserted into the trading world of the ancient, but had more contacts with Egypt than Athens certainly did. And that's just one island, but lots of these islands, Milos, Santorini, Naxos, islands that we sort of think of always in terms of recreation and holiday, are actually hugely important in a very early period of Greek history. And lastly, the crucial thing is I felt all along, and I was trying to kind of grasp this idea, that the fractured nature of the Greek geography, in other words, a lot of rocky islands scattered in a very unpredictable sea, gave rise to a very, very particular mindset, which was very, very different from those that had come before. And by that I mean the Egyptians in the Nile Valley and the Mesopotamians in the Euphrates-Tigris Valley. And that geography, that fragmentariness, because the Greek world originally was a sea dotted with islands and with ports all around it, one of which was Athens, though its principal port was Piraeus, but the city was oriented to the sea. It was a sea-oriented world and not a land-oriented. When we say Greece today, we tend to think of the Balkan Peninsula, what we see on the map as the Hellenic Republic. Okay, to an ancient Greek, and let's hear what one really great ancient Greek named Socrates had to say. He says, we Greeks live like frogs around a pond. And what he meant was that the Greek cities are all like a lot of different croaking frogs on the edge of the pond, which is the Aegean. Now, that fragmentariness, that difficulty for anyone to unite them, and the fact that there were lots of small units, and the units were to some extent self-determining, means that human thinking took a big change when it came into the Greek world, and we can talk about how it comes into the Greek world later. And the foundations of our way of thinking and it's a platitude to say that democracy comes from ancient Greece, but democracy comes from the geography of ancient Greece, because small units, the equal size, forming alliances and changing, like parliamentary democracy, and of course governing themselves, the first self-governing units, as far as we can tell, with a kind of...
It feels, from our modern nation-state perspective, an odd way, concept to get our heads around. Another place I went to, thanks to your books, was Rhodes, and you have this sense, with the Knights Hospitaller versus the Knights Templar. Each state had its own, each island had its own kind of story.
Very much so. Yeah.
Like Paros. We went down the mine shaft that you recommended we go down to see, which was actually boarded off, but we kind of went over the barriers. And you can see those striations in the wall, those little, where the marble has been kind of picked out. And that,
they're moving,
supplied marble from Paros, not in the ancient world, but for Napoleon. And but how did you put that together? Was that just years of traveling and observing and writing, and that you put together at the end, or was it kind of you picked an island and you did it, then you moved on to the next
Yeah,
one?
no, it was step by step, but it was just driven by a bit of obviously passion, but also the discovery that, incredibly, all these islands were so different one from another, and that'll be your experience. You've been to Chios, you mentioned Paros. I mean, they're as different as chalk and cheese. You can't generalize about the Greek islands, except they're sort of rocky and have nice seascapes and beaches and things. But no, I mean, they have very, very different stories, very different geographies, very different climates, very different histories, different minerals, and different things that they've contributed to human endeavour and human culture. It's extraordinary in such a small place. Now that contrasts very much. I mean, this is not a game of awarding prizes for Greece being a more interesting culture than Egypt or Mesopotamia. For heaven's sake, that would be stupid. But it is very, very different when you live along the border of an extraordinary corridor of water which flows through the middle of a desert, as the Egyptians did for millennia, with that regularity of the flooding of the Nile, which they thought was a divine gift to their country, quite rightly. The movement of the planets, so regular, from east to west across this north-south river, the river that they could sail down because the current took them from the south to the north, and they could hoist a sail and go back upstream because the prevailing wind is always from the north to the south. The regularity, the unity of Egypt and its world contrasts totally with the Greek world, and its government was pharaonic, the ancient Egyptian government, and the social structure was a pyramidal with the semi-divine or divine pharaoh at the top, quite different from the Greeks, who sat in these noisy theatres and discussed the small issues of their small island.
So you started setting the scene, I guess, for your book about Pythagoras. Why don't we continue to do that? He's a 6th century BC philosopher. What was going on? Can you just give a little, short history of what happened in Greece before? When was the Trojan War? What happened after that, and before getting to the 6th century? And also set the scene with what's happening to the east of Greece in Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, Mesopotamia, and to the west in terms of, or the south, I should say, in terms of Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things there. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Greece has a very unusual early history because it has, in the Bronze Age, which is a long, long period, fascinating period, we call it the Bronze Age, but I mean, that in itself is an extraordinary thing because bronze is made of copper and tin, and there's lots of copper on the island of Cyprus. That's why it's called Kupros. I mean, some name tells you. Yeah, right. But you need that 10% of tin to make bronze, which is a fundamental thing for weaponry, for all kinds of cutting tools and so forth. And the tin really comes from very few places in Europe. It comes from Cornwall, Brittany, Galicia, the extremities of Europe. And so when we talk about the Bronze Age, we should remember that it's an age in which there was a lot of communication by trade from Cornwall down back into the Aegean area. The Bronze Age produced great art and in Greece. But for some reason around the 1200s, about the time, the late 1100s BC, 1200s BC, the time that we generally associate with the Trojan War, there was a massive breakdown and an influx of refugee people. They're often called the sea people. We don't know quite where they came from, whether they were pressed by famine or whatever. But the point is that world, that delicate island world, which had been producing great art, which you can see in the paintings in Santorini, you can see in the sculptures from the Cycladic islands, broke down. And what's commonly called the Dark Ages followed. and at the emergence from that Dark Ages. In other words, there was a resetting for about 200 or 300 years, from about, let's say, 1100 BC through to 800 BC, in which things are, as I say, resetting. And then the first signs of life we have are with Homer, his great nostalgic poems about that past, that Bronze Age past, clearly remembering that. And then the lyrics of Sappho, and then the coming of Greek culture.
That?
Sorry?
When was that? When was Homer writing?
We're talking about 800s, 700s, and then the 600s for Sappho, and then for Pythagoras, 500s, and so forth, the philosopher. Now, all that contrasts with the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, where there is a continuity. I'm not saying that they didn't have their ups and downs. Obviously, there are civil wars within Egypt. There are changes of dynasty. The same also for the Euphrates and Tigris. But there was a continuity going on all along. So Greece comes onto the map again with a kind of renewed energy of a sort of rebound, as it were. Something with this nostalgic remembrance of a great past, but a complete break with it. And it finds itself in terms of planetary geography in a very particular place. It's a sea, as we said, scattered with islands. Europe on one side, one great continent. Asia on the other side. It's like a little funnel, a bridge, stepping stones. I mean, these islands really are stepping stones, the Greek sea, between the East and the West, between Asia and Europe. And also between north and south, because there's the Black Sea to the north, the Straits of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, then the Aegean, and then that communicates down to Egypt. So trade, very important trade from the Black Sea. All kinds of things like gold and leather and furs and things which are essential for the winter are coming through there and going to Egypt, and vice versa, things going backwards and forwards, but most importantly, the East-West. Now, like two poles of a battery, the West, Europe is a culture at this point that we know, I mean, mainland Europe, that we know much less about. It certainly doesn't have, at this point, the glorious productivity and creativity and thinking of, say, Egypt and Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
So there's a pressure, as it were, on that side, and a sort of emptiness on the European side. And Greece forms this bridge between them at this crucial moment, always linked by trade. I mean, trade is the one thing that leads thinking and culture by the nose. If you don't have trade...
One of the things, Nigel, you talk about is that because the sea is quite constraining, and in this rebirth after this dark age, population growth and then a diaspora of Greeks just sort of spread across Europe all the way to Spain, the northern side of Europe. Is that
the coastline of Europe? Yeah,
the coastline. Sorry, yeah. Is that part of this story as well?
Absolutely, and it goes back again to the geography. We talked about the fragmentariness before, but let's not forget the poverty. I mean, the real poverty of the Greek. I mean, you'll know this from having been, say, to Paros. Anybody who's been on holiday to a Greek island will know they're not great for cultivation. There are no rivers, not much water. I mean, you can't build an agrarian economy on the Greek islands in the way that the Egyptians just had this flooding Nile, which brought silt every year and enriched their soil and produced harvest after harvest. I mean, it's so different. So the Greeks had, and there was very little fresh water. They could only sustain a certain number of people, because when the water was not enough for the growing population, and the population had to go somewhere else. So they start to spread out, but always in places where they can be connected by sea with the sort of, let's call it the homeland of the Aegean. So they go all up and round the edge of the Black Sea. Yes, around the south of Italy, Sicily, south of Italy into the Adriatic, and then on into the south of France, Marseille, Antibes, Nice. These are all Greek towns, Marsilia, Antipolis, Antibes, Nicaea, Nice, and down into Spain. So yes, this was a product of their dependence on trade, because they had such a poor land.
And there's a hot zone though. That hot zone or epicenter is that region called Ionia, and you mentioned Homer, Sappho, and also Herodotus, Heraclitus. All these people come from this narrow strip. Where is Ionia? Why is its geography important in the context of trade? And what can you expand on the significance of the type of people, including our heroes of your book?
No, you're absolutely right. In all this, there is a hotspot, which is Ionia, and Ionia is an ill-defined. It's not not an area with a border at all. It's an ill-defined cultural zone, as it were, unified by a language, an Ionian language, which is the language that Homer used. And it's really it's on obviously what is now the coast of what is today Turkey, but was then the ancient Greek world, and the islands next to it. And particularly in the middle of that coast, in other words, going from about Izmir or ancient Smyrna down to Bodrum today, Halikarnassus, which actually was part of a Dorian cultural area. But that Ionia there, Miletus, those cities there just to the south of Izmir and Smyrna are it. Now, it's hugely important because of a big sort of autostrada of the ancient world, a thing called the Royal Road, which was something which joined the capital of Persia. And there were several capitals in the Persian Empire, but they were joined by this road which maintained communications with the western part of the Persian Empire, which came right to the edge of the Aegean Sea, pretty much, at a place called Sardis, just inland of the island of Samos, where Pythagoras comes from. So there's a lot of trade and ideas and music and poetry and ancient aesthetics, all these things from the east coming down this, as I call it, autostrada, the Royal Road, communications, being rather like an ancient Silk Road, if you like, and coming to a sort of halt there in the Greek world at the Aegean, opposite these islands, which, as I said, were the kind of stepping stones for the rest of Europe. And so this mercantile mentality of the Greeks, shipping, trading, because they're not cultivating, they're not sowing and reaping as the Egyptians were, taking note of the number, the quantities of grain, storing them in. They weren't doing any of that. They were trading, and so it's what creates a different kind of mentality. So all this Eastern knowledge and poetry and music and things like that is coming out of the East, sort of pausing there before going on into the West, in this extraordinarily different geography, in which there are people who are governing themselves up to a point, and most importantly, don't have a king, don't have a pharaoh, don't have any overarching, there are a lot of, it's like a choir that's got no director, everybody's singing their own song. That's what the Greek world is like. So it's a very, very interesting and important place for Ionia.
So it's almost like this petri dish or
absolutely
sort of nursery garden where there's no leader or ruler deciding that this is what knowledge is, this is what good behavior is. And also, as importantly, there's no theological diktats, which you talk about.
No priesthood. Really important. Yeah, because as well as the pharaoh, the priests in ancient Egypt had huge power. The same in Mesopotamia, as well as the kings. The priesthood was the conservative embodiment of all knowledge and therefore of power. And the Greeks didn't have this. Now, if you don't have someone telling you, or a sacred text telling you that God created the world in 7 days, or that you mustn't marry this person, you mustn't eat that, you must do this, you must observe the following things, you must respect priests, and blah, 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 so forth. If you don't have that, then in your little communities, each little island, each little frog around Socrates' pond has to sort of kind of work out those things for themselves. Why are we here? Where did we come from? What is the world? What created the world? Because it's not a thing that's been revealed by priesthood or by God or by a prophet. No, you just have to sit and debate it and work out and think about it. And that's why these thinkers, really are hugely important. They're picking up ancient knowledge. I'm talking about Heraclitus, Pythagoras, many the pre-Socratics, Thales, Anaximander, these sort of people are picking up things that have already been observed in the East and are looking at them with an entirely independent and fresh and basically scientific and non-theological mind. And Pythagoras is important in this because he is the first, I think, one of the first great I want to use the word de-anthropomorphize, which sounds terrible, but that's what I mean. He de-anthropomorphizes the divinity. The divinity is no longer Zeus with a beard sitting on a throne on Olympus. It's no longer Aphrodite with her louche. It's not. Maybe we feel this is a loss, the poetry of these wonderful figures. He creates a cosmos, as he calls it, that doesn't have squabbling gods in it. So he, in that sense, de-anthropomorphizes the divinity and says that there are divine things in our world.
So we have a vacuum where ideas are allowed to bounce off each other, and the significance of those ideas and that knowledge which is coming from the East a lot of the time is being understood. And in that special period of the 6th century BC in Ionia, you've got Pythagoras, as you say. So why don't we turn to kind of who he was, what do you think his background was, what little do we understand about him, and how have you kind of pieced that together?
Yeah, the problem, as I say at the beginning of this book, is that we know next to nothing about Pythagoras. And you may well say, well, how can you write a book about Pythagoras if we don't know anything? We hear lots of stuff about Pythagoras because for centuries afterwards, people chattered about him and, what he said and what he did. But we know for certain very little. And my book's only an attempt to sift through all the chatter, the chattersphere, as it were, and try and see what underneath he was actually possibly saying. Now, he's important because in this world that we've just described, one of the things we can say about him was that he was a traveller. He came probably from a mercantile family, though his father's also described as a gem engraver, actually from what we would call the Lebanon today, from the town of Tyre. So he had a slightly international background, we think, but almost certainly certainly grew up in this trading milieu on the island of Samos, and he travelled. He went to Egypt. That much we do know because Polycrates, the tyrant of Samos, that means the ruler of Tyre, of Samos, gave him a letter of introduction to the pharaoh of Egypt. And he went to Egypt probably once, twice, 3 times. That's fairly clear. Less clear is that he went also to Babylon. But in the end, it doesn't really matter for understanding Pythagoras whether he went in person to these places. He was listening. He was picking up. He was on the frequency of what the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians were saying. And not only that, but what was coming out of India. And this is something that, this was a revelation for me because I grew up going to school and we heard about a lot about ancient Greece. And we heard a bit about sort of the Egyptians who were sort of rather unusual, but we heard nothing about how important early India was in the creation of Western thinking. And this comes through Pythagoras, because he clearly, we can give a little instance of it later on if you want, is clearly picking up things from ancient Vedic literature, in other words, literature from India of the period that we would call the Bronze Age in the West, the second millennium BC. And so whether he went to India or not, we can't say. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he went to Babylon, maybe he didn't. But he had enough. He was meeting people, because this was a very fluid world. We think that everybody just stayed at home. Well, of course, 90% did. But the traders and traveled huge distances. And actually in the 6th century, they could do it more easily between East and West than almost any other time in ancient history, because of a man called Cyrus the Great, the great emperor the king of kings of Persia, because he unified that southern Asian world from the Indus River right through to the shores of the Aegean in one kingdom, his own kingdom. He was an enlightened man by all accounts. He's spoken of with respect both in the Old Testament of the Bible by the Greeks, Herodotus obviously. He was greatly admired by Alexander the Great, who did something rather similar in the other direction, unified that same tract of land from the Greek world. So it was a time when somebody could travel quite, and trade was very, very vibrant. And therefore when there's vibrant trade, then there's vibrant ideas coming. And not just ideas, but I've always said music. Music's a very important part of this revolution, particularly in connection with Pythagoras. And, aesthetics as well. These things come through in effect, Eastern. So India, Babylon and Egypt are very important, but their funnel is more Pythagoras than anyone else.
Right.
He's not the greatest of all those thinkers or the most original at all. Heraclitus is extraordinarily original. So is Anaximander in his thinking. I mean, and Pythagoras perhaps doesn't reach that, but he is a wonderful transformer of what he learns from the East.
Well, let's give people a taste of it without giving too much away. I think you've separated his fundamental observations and the universality of those observations into 3 parts loosely. One is cosmos, the other one's harmony, and the other one's philosophia. Can you talk to the etymology or philology, which one's the right term, and the significance to those in his observations and why they have percolated or have been expanded on as the foundation sort of how we think today?
Okay, yes, certainly. Let's happily do that. There are 3 words, and they're 3 words that we know that he seems to have been instrumental in changing their meaning, and I'll explain in a moment that. And they are cosmos, as you said, harmonia, harmony, and philosophia, philosophy. Let's just look at harmony first, because this brings in to our mind the question of music. And the fundamental thing that Pythagoras brought from the Babylonian world was an understanding of tones and intervals in musical harmony. Okay? The Babylonians had observed that if you have strings of different lengths under tension and you twang them or you rub them with a thing rather like a primitive bow, a violin's bow or whatever, they'll make a sound. And according to the exact mathematical proportions of lengths, they will either be in disharmony, make an unpleasant sound, or at one particular moment, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, depending on whether we're talking about a musical fifth, a musical fourth, a third, or whatever. They come in and they create a beautiful sound, harmony. Now, he took the word harmony from the carpenter. We know from carpentry, from woodworking, because in Homer, that word harmonia and harmozo, the verb harmozo, means to create a beautiful joint, like a dovetail between 2 things. And Homer talks about Odysseus making and joining the pieces of wood for his raft when he leaves the island of Calypso. He uses
fit.
Sorry?
A snug fit.
Snug fit, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And he takes that for musical harmony and says, at this moment, this mathematical moment of perfect proportion of length of string, one to the other, 3 to 4, 2 to 3, and so forth, we get this snug fit, and it is a harmonia. So he began to perceive that behind what we call beautiful was a mathematical structure based on number. So that word was very interesting. The other word that he liked and used and changed in a similar way, was cosmos. Okay, cosmos, again, we have to look for Homer, because Homer's the first Greek literature we have of the modern era, the post-Bronze Age. And therefore we have the first uses of words there. And cosmos means two quite distinct things in Homer's world. In the Iliad, he talks about it being the cosmos, the order in which soldiers are arranged, or sailors are seated in a boat, the rowing sailors or whatever. In other words, the arrangement, the correct arrangement is the cosmos.
Right.
But it's interesting also in the Odyssey, he talks about Hera, who's the queen of the heavens, the spouse of Zeus, and the cosmos of the decoration of her face, the makeup of her face, when she wants to be her most beautiful and most majestic. And so cosmos meant to the ancient Greeks also the beautification, let's say, of a face. And that's gone straight into our language in the word cosmetics. Now, you may think there is nothing in common between cosmetics and Chanel and all that, and the cosmos, the universe. But the origin of the word is the same. And this fits with what Pythagoras was talking about with harmony, that beauty and order, just as with music, the order is the mathematical structure which lies behind the beauty that the music appeals to our ears. So he's beginning to build up, with these words, a picture of something very important, harmony, kind of something good, beauty, something good that enhances our lives and gives meaning to our lives, as having a natural mathematical order to it. And the last word, philosophia, is on a different axis in all this. And it relates to that, what we were saying earlier on about the Greeks not having a revelatory text, a sacred text, a testament, a Bible, a book of the dead, scriptures of some another. How are we going to know things? By having an open knowledge, open attitude towards knowledge, being open to anything, listening, examining. And philosophia simply means, philoxenia in Greek means, the philos just means being open to, being welcoming to, the xenos, the foreigner, hospitality. Philosophia is just being open to, friendly towards, accepting of, welcoming to Sophia, knowledge. And that this is really what he implies should be, in a way, a religion for us. And he does, instead of just accepting and chanting and saying what the liturgy says, we should love knowledge for what it is, because it can help us to become more illuminated. So those three words, really, really important.
And the idea of the final one, as you've said, is an act of receiving rather than an act of kind of doing. People think of philosophy today as this sort of ivory-towered activity where you're saying long words and trying to confuse people and, sound smart. But for Pythagoras, it was more of a observational activity, to be open to lots of different things. And in the dogmatic world we live in, that's kind of hard to fathom right now.
It is, because philosophy, as you rightly says, has such a different sort of connotation and feeling to it. And I like to think of Pythagoras in a way as an anti-philosopher, because he seems to have eschewed words. I mean, there is nothing written by Pythagoras at all, nothing that has survived. And there's actually very little evidence, except one thing in Diogenes Laertius much later, saying that he wrote certain books. We don't know him. I mean, but Diogenes was writing, 500 years after Pythagoras, 600 years afterwards, so he may not have known correctly.
Yeah.
But Pythagoras avoids words, and his philosophy is based on just simply showing certain things. The musical experiment, the theorem of the triangle, which everybody hates, and nobody wants to buy the book because they think it's going to be about math and triangles and all that. Well, it's the beauty of that, that it's a law which he discovered. Well, he didn't discover it. Again, he took it from the Babylonians, who knew this and used it, and the Egyptians used it. But they didn't see the wider significance of this.
Yes.
That there was this order behind everything, and so the triangle, the square on the two shorter sides of a right angle triangle is equal to the square on the hypotenuse, the longer side, is in itself, not something that lights up our life, but what it purports, that there are these things which are universal. Which are not about sort of a hypothesized God or Ra or one of the divinities of ancient Egypt or whatever. It's simply something which is true everywhere. And that's...
It reminds me of a story which we've talked about before in a very different domain in Silicon Valley of all places, where Xerox was a very successful company, and it was based on the east coast of America, and it had a research center, a kind of R&D center in Palo Alto. It was called Xerox Park, Palo Alto Research Center. And they were kind enough to give the Apple team in the 1970s a tour of the research center. And the Apple team saw this thing called a graphical user interface, which is where computers before then were very different, that you could move a mouse and it would move on the screen, and you could type something and it would appear on the screen. And they were like, have you told anyone about this? And, oh yeah, this is something we're playing with, some sort of gimmick, one of many gimmicks we have lying around here. And they didn't, what the Apple executives saw was the universality of this, the power of this thing that was sat there with Xerox doing nothing about it. And they, mentally copied it, stole the idea, and took it back, and the rest is history when it comes to computing, because they've made computing universal. Do you think...
That's very interesting, because that's a case of picking up the ball and running with it, which is what we're talking about with the ancients.
Exactly. So, my question is, do we overvalue originality, whatever that means, over and above actually observations and mixing two ideas and putting them together to create mixing copper and tin to create bronze, and the positive sum impact of that more powerful combination than the two inputs, for example, is more a creative act than it is sort of sitting in the bath having a eureka moment of kind of pure theoretical original thinking.
No, I think that's true. I mean, what is originality? I mean, the seeing of the potential of an idea is also great originality.
Yeah.
But I think it's just important in the case of someone like Pythagoras. I mean, it's generally said, that's just a mistake that he discovered the law of the right angle triangles and the relation of their sides. He didn't. I mean, it was known probably 1,000, maybe even 1,200 years earlier in Babylon. And you may say, well, why is it so important? Well, it actually was terribly important, because if you know that 3, 4, and 5, 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared, 9 plus 16 equals 25, gives you a right angle. When you arrange these lines, you make sticks. You're just early construction. You may have sticks that are 3 units, whatever they are, 4 units and 5 units. And you can make a wall which is straight and a doorway which is straight. If your doorway isn't at a right angle, then it isn't a doorway anymore. You have a problem having a door in it. So 3, 4, 5 was really important, and it had been used by everybody for ever and ever and ever. But Pythagoras saw that it was a unit. It fitted with his other observations. It wasn't just on its own. It fitted with his understanding that there was physics. It's the birth of physics, that there is a law governing, there is mathematical coherence governing the world we are in, that it's not just subject. In this sense, he's the great de-anthropomorphizer. We live in a world which is not just at the mercy of scrapping gods and all the rest, but one in which there is order. That doesn't solve all our problems, but it does give us a framework.
I think part of the challenge of this conversation in many ways is that we're talking about things that in 2024, or whenever someone's going to be listening to this in the future, seem obvious. This is, what's the... Even if it's significant at the time, why is it relevant to me? It's a bit like trying to get someone to read Lady Chatterley's Lover or listen to Jimi Hendrix for the first time, and you kind of go, in the age of MTV music videos, Lady Chatterley's Lover doesn't seem particularly revolutionary, but at the time, and I think what comes across from reading the book is that, you go on that journey of understanding how Pythagoras came to make these observations and understand their significance. And one of the things that enables you to do that is, this story, probably apocryphal, you say, about the fact that when he finds his school in southern Italy, you're not allowed to speak for 5 years when you join the school, because you just have to sit and listen and observe the winds and the woods and the trees and the sky before you're allowed to kind of sound clever or talk and opine. It is that understand, and that point, does that point to that definition of philosophia that you see? It's that act of receiving rather than an act of having an opinion quickly for an op-ed that's deadline tomorrow, or whatever it might be.
Yes. This tallies with all. It's a spiritual. What you've just described is what happens in monastic communities, and in Zen. The business of being still and listening, and whether or not it's true about Pythagoras. This thing about students having to be quiet for the first so many years of their apprenticeship, even if these schools did in fact exist. It shows that Pythagoras certainly had an interest in the spiritual side of things as well. And this is where India, I think, is very, very important, because he's bringing also, as well as all this kind of rather technical stuff about musical theory and geometry, he's bringing, for the first time, the ideas of the transmigration of the soul, that the soul is something that lives beyond our life, beyond our death, which was something the Greeks had no feeling for. Homer's view of death is a very, very gloomy and sort of hopeful one. Pythagoras brings into the West, principally from India, the notion that yes, life can move from one being to another, and that therefore we're not just confined to this life. Now that's really important, and we only really know this from the one anecdote, one contemporary anecdote that still survives, about Pythagoras. All other anecdotes are, hearsay. Much later, they're Chinese whispers. But there's one anecdote told by a contemporary of his called Xenophanes of Colophon, and Colophon was just a city across the water from Samos. So probably Xenophanes knew Pythagoras, same period. And he says that Pythagoras was in the marketplace one day and a man was beating a dog. And Pythagoras said, "Stop beating the dog." Yes, essentially, stop beating the dog because I recognize in its barking the voice of a deceased friend of mine. Now, this actually gives rise to the title of the book on Pythagoras. The publisher said, "Don't put Pythagoras in the title or nobody will buy it." So the title is "When the Dog Speaks, the Philosopher Listens," referring to this anecdote, which is the only one we have from a contemporary of Pythagoras. Wonderful, first of all. I mean, we like people who intervene to stop people being cruel to animals on a simple level. But he's also saying something much more important. I mean, he's saying something which seemed to his contemporaries and seemed to Xenophanes to be a little bit ludicrous and worthy of being teased about, that the dog might have the voice of a deceased friend of Pythagoras. That's not the point about it. It's simply saying to humanity, to us, listen, there is a kinship in all natural beings. We're all at a deep level related. Okay, it's not necessarily it's the voice, but I can hear the voice of a deceased friend. That's how he metaphorically expresses it. But there is a kinship in nature, which is terribly, terribly important. And we are part of that fabric, along with the animals, which we may become or have been us, or we may be again, or whatever, and the plants and so forth. So he introduces into the Greek world this idea of the transmigration of the soul, which Plato later toys with, but makes rather more literal. And of course, then get completely lost with the arrival of the Abrahamic religions in the West, with principally, not just Judaism, but Christianity and Islam, where God says to mankind, to created mankind, this is your garden, do anything with it. This is your domain, you use it. It gives us this unfortunate attitude to nature that it's something to be used, not to participate in. And that's creating us lots of problems today.
I think that's a good segue to a discussion on beauty. Even my exposure to Hindu philosophy and the Vedic tradition that you've touched upon with the transmigration of souls. When we say don't beat the dog, it's partly driven by the fact that we see ourselves in we say why? Well, because I see myself, or my friend in. And what we're saying is we're seeing that the dog has a soul and it's more than just flesh and bones. And a lot of religions maybe have been guilty of, including the Hindu one, I would say, of devaluing the body in many ways and saying, well, we are just a soul, or there's nothing, it's just flesh, it doesn't matter. And, that's just in the temporal realm, and there's a spiritual realm which is superior and higher, and we need to strive to reach the spiritual realm, and what happens in the temporal realm is irrelevant.
So
I interviewed Alex Martin a few months ago, and he talked about a hatred of ugliness, and at the time I was like, well, that's a bit of a trite thing to say, or what's the original on that? Who likes ugliness? What do you mean by that? And it's from reading your book on the importance of beauty, and what I never even reflected on what is beauty, right? So what, in terms of harmonia, what is this? What is beauty to you? Can you kind of explain to me why what Alex said isn't
No, I agree absolutely with what Alex says. A hatred of ugliness itself, because it's something, which disturbs us in the way that disharmonious music disturbs us, agitates us, and harmony brings us peace. Okay, what is beauty? Beauty is is the quality of something to go beyond what's on the surface. In other words, you have 2 notes, or 3 notes, or maybe 5 notes, and you bring them into harmony, and they become so much more than the sum of each of their noises. They become a harmony. They become beautiful to us. They become beautiful to our ears. Okay, maybe that sounds a bit abstract. Let's take a really fleshy example, if you'll excuse me, sex. I think we've all had in life the experience of what we might call beautiful sex, as opposed to sex which is not beautiful. I mean, we know there's a big difference between these. There is a harmony, there is something which goes beyond simply the union of 2 bodies in the beautiful sex, as opposed to what is done for rote or without without the quality of beauty. So beauty is coming to mean, at least for me and for Pythagoras, and I think for many poets in the past, and I quote Keats at the end, who said, "Truth is beauty, and beauty is truth, and truth beauty. It's all you need to know, and all you ever know." It's giving meaning to something. It's the moment when something just comes into that order, that cosmos, that releases meaning and releases a greater dimension, so that you don't just see 2 people copulating, you see beautiful sex. You don't just see 2 notes vibrating, you have harmony. And it's something you can find everywhere, and we've lost the ability to concentrate on that. Just take a nice, not too ripe, but ready pear, slice a bit of the flesh off and eat it. I mean, the flavour of a pear is something so beautiful and so unique. It can do what... I mean, I spent a life, because I've dabbled with Buddhism and Christianity and all these things. And I spent sort of hours trying to sit in special positions and empty my mind of this and that and meditate and pray. And, nobody ever speaks to me when I pray. And then I can never get down to the total emptiness, and I'm doing a meditation on nothingness and all that. And I think, it doesn't work for me. Mm. But when I feel gravity under my feet, when I feel the taste of a pear, when I see, the beauty gives meaning to my life. I'm happy to be alive. At other moments, I'm not necessarily happy to be alive, not even aware of the fact I'm alive. But beauty makes us aware. And this goes back to your excellent point that these religions have tended to take us away from the body. What the hell? Our bodies is where we live in this life. We shouldn't be downgrading it. Our bodies have all kinds of problems, but they're windows to things of great beauty and meaning and significance. If we want our life to have meaning, which we all do, purpose, we want it to have some meaning, our being here. And beauty is what we have to look for. Yeah, sorry, long answer to a difficult question.
Well, it's a question. I mean, I know it's a tough question because I've got a quote from your book where you say the importance of beauty can neither be justified nor explained. It can only be intuited. Without it, our human existence has no meaning. And I've had a similar definition of the divine in many ways, where you ask someone what's the divine, and they go, well, if you try and define it, it's no longer divine. It loses its divinity. So let's not try and force it down that funnel of words or that pipe, something that cannot be reduced to mere words, something that is felt and intuited. But I think in terms of meaning, you're right. Beauty drives us to kind of do good work, create nice things, create good things that, are beautiful and helpful. And the more beautiful they are, the more successful they tend to be. If you take, an iPhone, for example, is in itself. They want the inside of the iPhone to be as beautiful as the outside, even though no one would ever see it. There's no ability to open your iPhone. But from what culture of that aesthetic importance percolates through our most important developments over time.
Yes.
I would love to talk more about Pythagoras, but I think people should definitely read the book
Thank you.
from this. What I would like to do is talk to you about a couple of separate things while I've got you, while I've got a subject matter expert such as yourself. One that we've touched upon a few times. You've talked about Pythagoras being exposed either through direct travel or through the travel of ideas or to the Vedic text, to India, and also to what was coming out at the same time in terms of Buddha. I, as a person of Indian origin, feel when I'm talking to Greeks, I get this sort of, again, it can't be explained, it can only be felt or intuited, this sort of sense of fraternity, for want of a better word, when a Greek is moaning about something, about their country or the culture, it just sounds very familiar. Or when they're excited about something, my best friend is of a Greek origin, and in the book, this kind of migration. Am I just spotting a false pattern here, or is there something more to that for Greeks and Indians, or Europeans and Indians, to kind of unite on culturally, spiritually, philosophically?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about it, and there's good evidence for what you're saying. It's just something that hasn't been thought about for a very long time, until recent decades. Western education was so concentrated on the West and didn't have this wider vision. But we now know that, and I think it's generally accepted, it may not be in all corners, that the people of the Indian subcontinent and the people of the Greek world that you're talking about are of Indo-European, hence the word Indo-European stock. They came from Central Asia. They were the same cultural, sort of phonetic group. And for whatever reason, because of, drought or whatever, they moved out of their homeland in the center of Europe and went in two different directions, west into Europe and south into the subcontinent. And those contacts have always been there, even though in recent times they've been separated, those two cultures and those two parts of the Indo-European identity, by Islam and of course the great Semitic peoples who occupied the space between. But they were unified, as we were saying earlier on, in the period of Cyrus the Great, by a sort of, in the same political sphere, and again by Alexander the Great. And it's very important to remember that Alexander, brought Greek culture. He didn't just travel with an army, he traveled with thinkers and scientists as well in his entourage, botanists, people who were to observe what was there and to listen to people talking, and to meet gurus and whatever. And he took his army right to the shores of the Indus, at which point they mutinied. He wanted to go on to the end of the world as he wanted it, but they mutinied and said, "We've been away from our wives too long and we need to get home." And so, he had to turn back. But he left behind these cities in which he encouraged those who were stationed to protect the cities to marry with the intermarry. And the culture, the Greco-Indian culture, which comes out of that area, Afghanistan and the borderlands, is really the beginnings of Buddhist visual art, because in the earliest centuries, the Buddha was never figured as a person that was not kosher. You had to figure him just by his footprints or by a sign or whatever. And the Greek, the Indo-Greeks of the area around Afghanistan today and Pakistan were the first to create Buddhist imagery. So that link between India and Greece is very, very ancient and has been reinforced in different ways by people like Pythagoras, by people like Alexander the Great. But there is an ethnic thing there, as a genetic thing there as well. And that's very interesting that you say that when you come to Greece, you feel a kind of affinity.
Yeah.
Which maybe you don't feel if you go to Egypt or whatever, because that's, I mean, it's not that it's any less great. Egypt is a wonderful country and still is, but it's a different people, a different gene, a different, a whole different universe. Yeah.
Well, it takes me on to my next question quite neatly, actually, because I think around the same time as that 6th century BC period, Pythagoras across the sea, I believe Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon had crushed Jerusalem or had besieged Jerusalem, and that was the end of the kingdom of Israel for the following few thousand years until 1940.
Sort of, yeah.
So what's in that conflict that we keep hearing about seeing today? I don't want to rehash it here in many ways, but are there any things that you see from your perspective as an ancient historian, art historian, who has knowledge of the ancient world, particularly that Levantine, that you just see? Is there parts of this conflict that are as old as time? Or that you can spot something in, or is it just purely a modern age conflict that has no relevance to the ancient world?
Well, I mean, if you forgive me for taking a very specific thing which came out of that conflict, rather than talking about it generally and it's playing out through time. I mean, there is Nebuchadnezzar's arrival is terribly important because it troubled the Egyptians, and the Egyptians came into conflict with Nebuchadnezzar and were having an ongoing war under the Pharaoh Necho II, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. And Necho, the Pharaoh of Egypt, was short of money. And so he called the best mariners of the time, who were Phoenicians. I mean, the Greeks were very good mariners, so also were the Phoenicians. The Greeks sort of populated the northern shores of the Mediterranean, the southern shores of Europe, and the Phoenicians, the northern shores of Africa, the southern side of it. They were both great traders, great trading peoples and navigators and mariners. And he said to this group of mariners, he said, basically the subtext was, I need, money and gold to finance my war against Nebuchadnezzar. Go south from the Red Sea and see what you can find. And he sent them off. This is all related to us by Herodotus, writing 150 years later. And around the year 600, they set off out of the Red Sea, and their remit was to find gold in Africa, or what they called Libya. The Egyptians called, and the Greeks called it Libya in those days, and sort of the rest of Africa that was not Egypt. And they set off and went further and further and further, and we don't know the details of the story, except that Herodotus says that 3 years later, they came back to Egypt, not through the Red Sea, but through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean from the west. What does this mean? It means they had circumnavigated the whole continent of Africa in 600 BC. Hugely important thing. I mean, whether they found the gold and that was necessary for Necho or not, but for whatever reason, they went on and on and on. They went down into the southern hemisphere, they went round the Cape of Good Hope and back up through those terrible swells through the west of Africa, finally came baid to the Straits of Gibraltar, hugging the coast of Africa, always on their right-hand side. And Herodotus says, they said when they came back something which, he sort of laughs and he says, I sort of don't really believe. He says, that when they were in halfway around their journey, maybe year 1.5, the sun was in the north of the sky, and the shadow of the mast of their ship fell to the north, not to the south. And he said, this is clearly impossible, because they knew, the sun always rose on the east and set on the west. But at one point, the position of the sun during the day wasn't anymore in the south, as it always was in the Mediterranean, but went into the north. And he says, maybe this is a reason for not, or he implies, maybe this is not a reason for believing that they didn't go around Africa. But for us, who know about modern astronomy and what happens when you go into the southern hemisphere, it's the confirmation that they really did. Now, that's a great thing to have done, so circumnavigate in the year 600 or around then the whole of Africa. But remember, this is just 50 years before people like Pythagoras and Heraclitus. And there would be a lot of chitter-chattering in the ports of the Mediterranean about this. Word would have spread like wildfire. What was wildfire? What was going on? What was happening? Why was the sun in the north? Why was the phases of the moon going in the opposite direction? All these things that you observe in the southern hemisphere that we now know perfectly normal because you're around the other side of the planet. And it's behind the thinking of people like Anaximander and Pythagoras. It's hugely important. Anyway, it's a bit of a digression, but it comes out of your question about Nebuchadnezzar in a way, and his impact on history.
Yeah, I think it's a region that's going to hopefully resolve itself. But we certainly hope we can learn from history in some way. And I think that in terms of kind of regional relations, that there's a question which I guess people, you're a Scotsman, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Specializing in ancient history, living in Greece. So I can feel people shouting at me to ask you, should the British Museum return the Elgin marbles?
Should they return the Elgin marbles?
In your view?
I think the whole game changed when the Greeks very cleverly constructed that marvellous museum, where they will be safe, in many ways safer than they are maybe in the British Museum. And so, yes, with many regrets, I think they should be. It is a problem. It's a very special case, that. It's a very special case because the Parthenon is a symbol of Greek identity. It is how can one say? It's the Colosseum for the Eiffel Tower. The Parthenon is associated with Greek identity, only far more deeply than either of those other two monuments I've just mentioned.
Yeah.
So there is a case there because of that. It doesn't mean to say that every other country can claim everything else back, because they're not things to do with national identity. Yes, the Turks immediately want the Pergamon altar back there, but that's not something that defines Turkishness particularly. It's evidently, it was a Greek creation anyway, long before Turks ever came into the peninsula of Asia Minor. So, I think it shouldn't be yes, in answer to your question, they should go back. And I think they will do. It's only a question of time, whether they go, legally as a loan or whatever, but they will go back, I'm pretty sure. But that shouldn't open the door to a mass exodus and a lot of spurious claims for all kinds of things. There are certain things, the Benin bronzes, the Parthenon marbles, certain things, it depends on many factors. It depends how they were removed, under what circumstances, and whether, importantly, they are things of national identity or cult. No, let's not talk about nations, because I hate nations. Cultural identity.
There's three arguments I think that are out there for Britain not to return them. Two are particularly good. One you've touched on, which is if you have to give that back, then you've got to give everything back to everyone. And you've already crossed that. One that is sort of, I guess, slightly compelling is that if you're an American or someone from Africa or someone from Asia visiting Europe for the first time, and you've got 3 days or a week, and you don't have time to kind of go everywhere. There's value in lots of these things being in one place so that you can cover as much of European civilization as you can in a trip, basically, so that you don't have to go everywhere. So London is a natural place for that to be. And the other argument that I've heard, which is again not very good, is that it would require an act of Parliament for it to be returned. Or it would demonstrate the kind of final end of Britain being a serious country. It's symbolic more than anything. Doesn't matter what it symbolises. Doesn't matter.
I don't think so. Take the Parthenon marbles out, and the British Museum is still one of the greatest collection of things and with didactic possibility anywhere in the world. I don't agree with that, and I don't agree with the second point. What was your second?
It's like the efficiency of having all these things in one place.
Yes. Okay, but I mean, the experience of seeing the Parthenon marbles in the Duveen Gallery in London, on one side, the experience of seeing them in Athens, in the Greek light, in the Greek context, with the Acropolis Hill behind visible from the museum. I mean, I agree. I mean, it's going to mean that some people are going to have to travel more if they really want to see these things. But it's so much more important to see works of art, if it's possible, in that context. And I mean, apropos of this, I studied the ancient Greek and Roman world at school. Okay, it meant nothing to me. I did it because it was part of school curriculum. But when I first went to Italy, when I went to Rome, I thought, shit, this all begins to make sense. It all comes together. And then when I went to Greece the first time and saw, what I was talking about earlier on, the sort of fragmentariness of the islands, the poverty of the natural environment, the rocks, the extreme light, then I began then I really saw what Greekness was about and what Romanness was about and what Italianness was about and all that. So I think there's an awful lot to be said for, as much as possible, seeing works of art, where they are. And within Greece itself, there's lots of discussion about whether works of art should be returned from particular islands, to Athens. There's many more people are going to see them in Athens than they are on the island of Carpathos or whatever. But that's it's important that people go to, Samos, see the Samos Kouros in his hometown.
Yeah, and that's, education with a small e doesn't exist in the classroom. It's not rote learning. It's not exam taking. It's going, as your life has demonstrated, Nigel, more than most people, is getting.
Well, I've taken hundreds of students to Italy, to Greece, and hope to open their minds to what these things are really about. That it's not just some dead culture that's maybe sort of quirkily interesting. It's fundamental to understanding who we are ourselves, where we come from, in what we call Western country.
As you know, I like to close these conversations with a question that I ask all guests. And we've talked a lot about the past. I'd like you to try and think about the future a bit. Use all that you know about the past and put that into some sort of mental model and make a prediction about the next 10 years. And I unfortunately have to keep it consistent across guests. You can do 8 or 12 if you'd like, but
I'd like 100 anyway.
Well, that's the thing. I think the reason why it's roughly 10 is because there's some form of accountability, but it's not so close to us that it's next year and it's kind of meaningless. And we can all have probably a pretty good idea that next year is going to be quite similar to this year. But is there something over the next 10 years that you think will play out, or that you would like to play out in the future, knowing what you know about the past? And you can frame that within a 100-year cycle if you'd like to.
Yes, well, I mean, as a historian, I tend to think in terms, of larger things and of cycles. I mean, political history, and we didn't actually get to talk about it because I went off on a digression between Egypt and Nebuchadnezzar. It is full of pendulums which swing to and fro, and I think Newton's third law of dynamics, whatever it is, to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, is the determining thing of the trends of politics and history. Okay, we're going through a resurgence at the moment, apparently of sort of right-wing feeling that sort of disturbs the left. But as soon as the pendulum goes far enough one way, then it swings back the other way. And I mean, in terms of 10 years, 20 years, the political cycles, they function like that. They go to and fro. It's the laws of motion, as said by Newton. The only one that seems to me that's a much, much longer cycle, if ever, is the environmental change. And let's put aside all the sort of claptrap which is talked about it not happening. I mean, even in the interview just the other day between Elon Musk and Donald Trump, Elon Musk was saying we don't really need to worry because it's still it's a long way off. I mean, he was just giving, in a way, Donald Trump a sort of free ticket on things environmental. I think all the people listening to this will know that we've been through a hotter summer or a more stormy winter, whatever. Things are just, changing. And human beings, I'm not saying that sort of the end is nigh. No, not at all. Human beings adapt, and they need to adapt. And they adapt only, they don't adapt in advance. When the scientists first start saying, things are going to change, and they're going to think, we all go, oh, well, that's a bit of a pity, but we'll wait. But the shit, excuse the expression, but it's a very useful one, is beginning to hit the fan. And we're feeling the heat. Even on this little island where I live, I came here 14 years ago, changed dramatically. Fire removed 20% of its green cover. A little stream and waterfall, which had run for millennia on this island, fed mills, all that kind of thing, has now completely dried up. The trees in it are drying. Everything's changing very much. Now, okay, I don't want to sort of moan about that. But I think because this is this moment when things are hitting the fan, in the next 10 years, I would watch for signs of the adaptation, human adaptation. And I think the obvious way we'll have to go is using huge open, we've got a demographic problem as well, the open spaces of the deserts, of the oceans for habitation. I think you're going to see just the beginning. You're not going to see them completed or realized, but the beginnings of thinking about how can we design urban habitation areas in these areas where we have a lot of space, like oceans, where there is free energy, and the deserts as well. I think we're going to see a lot of thinking about this, and I would think 2034, if we were to have this conversation, there'll be some things on the drawing book. There is something already on the drawing book. I'm sure Saudi Arabia, Prince, whatever his name, bin Salman, Mohammed bin Salman, who is the Prince of Saudi Arabia, is promoting this great project for a city in the deserts north of Jeddah called Naim, which is going to be a new city which is going to be self-sufficient, energy from the heat of the desert and all that kind of thing, using area which is otherwise unproductive for integrated living, which will take the pressure, if there are more of these, off the areas, particularly in the very inhabited countries like Britain, Japan, whatever, which, heavens, do we have any wild spaces in Britain anymore? Do we have any wild spaces in Japan anymore? In Holland anymore? In Germany anymore? It's the roads, industrial complexes, it'll take the pressure off that. And maybe a way forward for conserving energy, consolidating things. It may be our way of adapting, but adaptation has got to happen. And I think in the next 10 years, 2014, we were still hearing scientists prophesying about it. 2024, we're seeing it hit the fan. 2034, I think we're going to see adaptation really gaining traction.
So
and imaginative.
It's quite an optimistic forecast in many ways. I think part of what, in my mind, what needs to change is the mindset, maybe away from a scientific approach to looking at the environment to more of a stewardship approach or a philosophical approach. In many ways, we don't know, we can't wait for the data to kind of validate, because by the time it validates, it's probably too late.
Yes, you're right.
We've got to treat ourselves as stewards of the oceans, of our environment, and think of it more in the way Pythagoras probably would have thought of it than someone with a lab coat crunching numbers on a spreadsheet and making forecasts. And we've only got one planet. We've got, we don't know what impacts we're going to make on it. We probably can't predict the impact of what we're doing, but we need to behave responsibly. And maybe that's a luxury belief that we can have in the West as wealthy people, but we need to kind of maybe get everyone else as wealthy as possible to have that belief, to have the bandwidth to start acting as stewards rather than, recipients of
I totally agree and second everything you're saying. That's a different and longer cycle. And if you'd asked me about 100 years or 50 years, that would have been a good thing to talk about, because it's about education. It's simply about, we've got to educate people, because as you say, it's a luxury that we think of as a Western liberal luxury, and sort of, those people who can afford to think in these terms. But, if you're lacking water in Africa, it's not much help. But education, in every way is the secret to the future, and we've got to educate people for that stewardship. Yeah. And that's why Pythagoras is actually important. People should read about Pythagoras, and then they'll become better stewards.
Yeah. Well, look, this has been an absolute, eye-opening conversation. I've learned so much about.
Thank you.
You've opened a window into, 50 odd years of learning at the coalface, and I recommend people look up your travel books. Nigel McGilchrist, pick an island, grab a book, go to the island, follow the book around the island, and whilst you're out there on the beach and not following the book, buy a copy of this, and read about Pythagoras, because what I like when I read books like this is I learn stuff about myself just as much as I learn about about the world and the history. And so I want to take a more Pythagorean approach to my life and be thinking about harmony and receiving and learning and listening more than people watching my podcast going, he needs to shut up more anyway. So hopefully future episodes I will take on a bit more of that.
Well, that's the nicest thing you could say. I'm very glad. Yes, that's what it should be.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, and I will link to all your work in the description, and I'd love to have you again soon.
Thank you very much.
This has been Meeting People. I've been your host, Amal Pandya. This is a podcast produced by Mass Cooper with music composed by Loverman.